A brilliant mathematician forgets the names of their own children. They cannot recognize the house they have lived in for 4 decades, yet place a pencil in their hand and ask them to ride a bicycle or sit them at a piano, and they can execute a flawless performance of a Beethoven sonata they have not practiced in 40 years. The hands retain what the conscious mind has lost. We are confronting a profound paradox of human neurology. We are discussing why how-to memories, skills like baking, driving, or playing an instrument, survive severe cognitive decline. And we are examining the specific power of the cerebellum in the structural resilience. Joining me to dissect this neurological fortress is Eloise. Let us start with the architecture of memory itself. It seems counterintuitive that a brain ravaged by Alzheimer's can hold on to a complex physical skill while losing basic biographical facts. The disease appears to discriminate in its destruction.
The key is that memory is not a single filing cabinet. For a long time, scientists assumed memory functioned as a monolithic entity. Researchers like Brenda Milner shattered that paradigm when studying patients with severe amnesia in the mid-20th century. The most famous case, known as Patient H, had his hippocampus removed to cure severe seizures. Following the surgery, he could not form new conscious memories. Yet, Milner had him trace a star while looking in a mirror. Day after day, he claimed he had never seen the tracing task before. But day after day, his hand improved at the task. He was acquiring a new skill without any conscious record of the lessons.
That observation must have forced a complete rewrite of existing medical textbooks. If a patient without a functioning hippocampus can learn a motor skill, then the brain must possess discrete hardware for different types of information. We are looking at the fundamental division between declarative memory and procedural memory. Declarative is the what? Names, dates, faces, the narrative of our lives. Procedural is the how, and the how occupies an alternate physical space in the brain.
You have pinpointed the exact structural divide. Declarative memory relies on the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobes. According to research published by the Mayo Clinic and various neurological institutions, those specific regions are the first to erode in diseases like Alzheimer's. The toxic amyloid plaques and tau tangles dismantle the hippocampus first. But procedural memory, the how-to skills, are etched into the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Those structures possess a stubborn resistance to that same pathology.
I want to focus our attention on the cerebellum. It sits at the base of the skull, tucked under the cerebrum. It contains more than half the neurons in the entire human brain, despite taking up a mere 10% of the volume. For decades, standard medical education relegated the cerebellum to basic motor coordination, keeping us balanced when we walk or reach for a glass of water. But calling the cerebellum a basic balance center feels reductive, given what modern research reveals about its role in cognitive preservation and complex skill retention.
It is a massive underestimation of the structure's true capability. The cerebellum functions as a sophisticated prediction engine. When you learn to knit or drive a manual transmission car, the cerebellum takes precise notes on the specific sequence of muscle movements required. It builds an internal predictive model. Once that model is perfected, the skill becomes automatic. You do not need the prefrontal cortex to govern the action anymore. And according to a comprehensive review in the journal PMC on the cognitive cerebellum and aging, this region remains immune to the early and middle stages of Alzheimer's disease. The pathology does not take root there until the terminal phases of the illness.
But what explains this specific immunity? Is it a matter of different cellular makeup, or is it protected by a distinct blood supply? It strikes me as a significant evolutionary advantage that the most fundamental survival skills, how to walk, how to eat, how to execute habitual tasks, are stored in a bunker that resists the initial waves of neurodegeneration. Nature seems to prioritize the physical mechanics of survival over the conscious narrative of the individual.
The exact mechanism of that resistance remains a major area of active scientific investigation.
Some neuroscientists theorize it is due to the distinct molecular signature of Purkinje cells, which are the massive, intricate neurons unique to the cerebellum. Others point to the dense, redundant connectivity of the region. But new studies suggest something even more dynamic than passive resistance. Research published on platforms like bioRxiv in recent years indicates the cerebellum might play an active compensatory role in the aging brain. When the cerebral cortex begins to fail, the cerebellum appears to increase its functional connectivity, attempting to maintain brain network integrity. It does not just act as a passive bunker, it functions as an active backup generator, compensating for the deficits of the shrinking cortex.
That introduces an intense theoretical tension in the field of neurology. There is a prominent debate about the concept of brain reserve. The traditional view of cognitive reserve focuses near total attention on the neocortex. The prevailing wisdom suggests that higher education, reading, or complex puzzles build a cognitive buffer in the cortex. If the cerebellum is acting as a backup generator, then our entire model of how to build cognitive resilience might be skewed. Are we overvaluing crossword puzzles and undervaluing physical, skill-based learning? It suggests a bias in how we define intelligence and brain health.
That is a brilliant point of friction among neuroscientists today. The Lancet Commission's major reports on dementia prevention emphasize factors like education and cognitive training. But there is a growing faction of researchers arguing that complex motor skills, like dancing, playing the cello, or learning a physical trade, build a unique type of cerebellar reserve. Because procedural memories bypass the vulnerable hippocampus, training those cerebellar circuits might offer a more durable form of protection against functional decline. Some forward-thinking clinicians argue we spend too much time trying to rehabilitate explicit memory in dementia patients, which is a losing battle against the pathology. Instead, they argue we should focus on leveraging their intact procedural memory.
I must push back on that specific approach. Leveraging procedural memory sounds excellent in a clinical paper, but how does that translate to meaningful quality of life for a family? If a patient can knit a sweater but cannot recognize their own spouse, the core tragedy of the disease remains intact. We must be careful not to romanticize this preservation of muscle memory as a cure or a sufficient substitute for episodic memory. The human experience is built on our shared narrative, not just our ability to execute a physical task.
You are correct to introduce that caution. Procedural memory does not replace the profound loss of identity and connection that comes with episodic memory failure. However, a strengths-based approach to dementia care, championed by institutions like the University of Washington Memory and Brain Wellness Center, changes the day-to-day lived experience of the patient in a tangible way. When caregivers focus with obsession on what the person has lost, it causes intense frustration and despair. When they engage the person in overlearned skills, having a former baker knead dough or a former carpenter sand a piece of wood, it reduces anxiety and provides a deep sense of agency and calm. It anchors the individual in a familiar action, even if they lack the explicit context for why they are doing it. The physical action provides a sanctuary from the confusion.
That frames the distinction in a more useful light. It is about emotional regulation and dignity rather than a medical cure. Let us look at specific examples of this phenomenon in culture. Music is the most cited instance. We see viral videos of elderly individuals with severe dementia sitting at a piano and playing complex jazz standards or classical pieces without a single error. Is music a strict procedural memory, or does it occupy a distinct, privileged space in the neural architecture?
Music represents a fascinating intersection of multiple brain networks. Playing an instrument is a high-level procedural memory, dependent on the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. But music also taps into the brain's deep emotional centers, like the amygdala, which are also very resistant to initial Alzheimer's pathology. So when a musician plays, they are not just executing an automatic physical sequence like an assembly line robot. They are accessing preserved emotional resonance. According to Mayo Clinic researchers, the areas of the brain that process and remember music suffer far less damage than the areas responsible for explicit facts. The musical syntax survives because it is woven into both the motor and emotional fabrics of the brain.
It is almost as if the brain encodes emotional and physical routines in a more primal, fundamental language than it does facts and dates. If we picture the brain as a massive municipal library, Alzheimer's is a fire that burns the card catalog and the history section first. But the basement archives, where the architectural blueprints and the emotional diaries are kept, sit behind heavy fireproof doors. The fire reaches them last.
That analogy captures the brutal architecture of the decline. Declarative memory is fragile because it requires a complex, delicate network of constant conscious updating. The hippocampus is always working, always binding new disparate facts together. Procedural memory, once consolidated through intense practice, requires zero conscious maintenance. It is etched into the physical structure of the cerebellar and basal circuits. It transitions from a software program to a hardware feature.
If procedural memory is this robust, it raises a practical question about intervention. Can we use this specific neural pathway to teach patients new skills after the onset of cognitive decline? If someone has a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, can they learn a new procedural task, or is the window of acquisition closed once the disease begins its march?
This is a massive frontier of current clinical research. A systematic review and meta-analysis published in recent scientific literature looked at procedural learning in individuals with amnestic mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's. The consensus reveals a fascinating truth. Procedural learning remains intact to a great degree. Patients with early dementia can learn new physical routines, though they might require more repetitions than a healthy older adult. This insight possesses immense practical applications for designing care strategies. You can train a patient to navigate a new hallway layout or use a new mechanical assistive device through sheer physical repetition, even if they cannot state the directions or the name of the device.
That shifts the entire paradigm of caregiving and environmental design for cognitive decline. Instead of giving verbal instructions, which rely on the hippocampus, caregivers should rely on physical repetition and muscle memory. You do not tell a patient how to use a new fork. You guide their hand through the motion 50 times until the cerebellum takes over the operation. You bypass the cognitive deficit altogether.
That is the exact strategy. You bypass the broken bridge and utilize the intact tunnel. It requires extreme patience, but it reduces the sheer frustration experienced by both the patient and the caregiver. We are witnessing a transition away from a pure deficit model, focusing on the memory that is gone and moving toward a preservation model. We identify the specific neural real estate that remains strong, like the cerebellum, and we build the daily routine around that preserved strength.
This exploration of the cerebellum and procedural memory forces a fundamental reevaluation of what it means to know something. In modern society, we place a massive premium on intellectual knowledge, the ability to recite facts, debate historical events, and articulate complex thoughts. But the brain seems to prioritize the physical reality of doing. The resilience of the how-to memory suggests that our most enduring connection to the physical world is not what we can state, but what we can perform.
The physical body holds its own profound silent intelligence. The tasks we practice day in and day out, the repetitive motions of our crafts, our hobbies, and our daily chores become the most indelible parts of our neurological architecture. When the conscious mind falters, the physical self remains anchored by the vast, quiet power of the cerebellum. The individual remains tethered to reality through action.
It is a profound reminder to value the skills of our hands just as much as the contents of our minds. Recommend this conversation to a friend who appreciates the hidden strengths of the human brain.
This is CARECAST. Exploring the heart of care.